Hey everyone, so in this video we want to talk about something that a lot of students asked me about, and that is vellum grains. Now, to set this up, it's relatively straightforward. What I have here is a scene with an environment light so that the scene is a bit nicer. And I've just a sphere here, nothing special, a third of a meter roughly in diameter. And all you need is a Vellum configure grain node. And if you connect that, which is just a normal constraint setup, nothing happens by default because you could put as an input already points in, but you can also use this node to create points from volume with this option, and then it fills your object, whatever it is that comes in, with points. And that might look familiar. This is like a points from volume node, so pretty much what we use for normal pop grains as well. And so all we have to do is lower the grain size to get more points. And then it also sets the mass internally. And what happens is that the constraints that are generated here are just connections, invisible. And what happens here is quite interesting because when we look at what comes out of the constraints, we can see there's nothing actually. We only get the points, but the points have an interesting attribute called isGrain. So this attribute here is all it needs for it to understand basically this is supposed to be a grain setup. And if we then put this now, of course, into a Vellum solver, and let's connect everything and let's quickly generate the ground plane. And we run this, we can see it basically behaves like grains. But as you can see, with the same problems as we have with pop grains, and that is that it's pretty kind of incorrect. And the reason, of course, is clear to us. It lacks the right amount of substeps that we need to calculate the collisions between the points. Because keep in mind that Vellum, as we talked about in the very first video about Vellum, is basically a PBD system. It's an XPBD system, so an extended version of the classical pop grains. So it basically is the same as pop grains, which means we have to increase the substeps if we want to increase the accuracy of the calculation, because you can see it has the same problem that pop grains have by default, that it doesn't keep the volume intact. And if we run further, then it starts to try to correct itself over time because it doesn't have enough substeps to calculate all the collisions during the simulation or during a single frame. So let's increase that to, let's say, 20 for now, or maybe let's be careful, let's say 10. And of course what happens, it becomes pretty slow or slower, but as you can see, more accurate. Actually, let's say 10 is enough in this case because at least it looks correct. But what we can see here already is the reason why I'm actually not showing Vellum grains as a, in my opinion, important technique. The first reason is you have a lot of points here that fly around like crazy. Pew! Those outliers. You have quite a lot of those very often with Vellum grain. So in my experience, and actually my experience in production, and I talk to other people about it, the Vellum grain is relatively unstable compared to a pop grain setup. That's the first thing, which of course you can fight by increasing the substeps. So we should see now less outliers with 20 substeps. But what you will get is over time, the closer you get to it, yeah, you can see it pretty well now, the random flyaways disappear. But what you get now is such a high substep number that the speed overall becomes pretty slow, and then you end up actually being slower than pop grains. So I tested that theory actually for many months now, because so often people actually use Vellum grains online, even people who really know what they're doing. And I really tried to ask around, do a lot of research on this, always assuming that I'm wrong. But I did a couple of tests and I couldn't find a single case where Vellum grains are not slower, or at least have the same speed as pop grains. And there's one example that I actually had in production. Like I said, a friend of mine sitting next to me, a colleague, he worked on a really complex sense simulation, so a classical pop grain simulation. And he started with Vellum grains because a lot of people assume it's better. And after about a week of work, he switched to pop grains because the vellum grains were less stable and slower. And in the end, the simulation was then done in classical pop grains. And that is the reason why I think it's not worth, at least for a beginner, because there is no advantage. And I still don't understand why so many people assume vellum grains are better just because they're newer. Nonetheless, we will look at some examples where vellum grains are actually better than pop grains because you can do certain things with them that you can't do with pop grains. And in this case, they're absolutely better, but those cases are relatively exotic in my opinion, and certainly not part of a classical beginner course. But let's start with the examples that I tested. And again, you could criticize my tests, fair enough, but I did a lot of different ones and they always came out with pop grains as the winner. So this is one example here. So what this is a simple sphere that is, turned into grains, and we have two vellum versions. And what I want to show you here is that you can of course have a vellum version that is faster than pop grains, but what you then get is an unstable version, and there's no advantage in an unstable version that is faster than a stable version, of course. So let's quickly run this, and so you can see what I mean by that. The unstable version tend to A, explode, B, never come to rest, as you can see, which is funny but really unrealistic, and 3, when you look at the behavior over time, it actually changes its volume constantly. So the stable version is kind of the minimum substeps that are found that makes the whole thing stable, which I think in this case is 13 substeps, but that totally depends on the case, so there's no value in knowing this number. And you can see roughly, the vellum stable version and the pop grain version are more or less the same. I would even argue that the vellum version is a little bit less stable because it changes its volume slightly, but I was generous to vellum. So the numbers I get here are actually that the stable version is almost double as long. So the simulation time took 51 seconds versus 32 seconds for pop grain, in a case where I would say the pop grain version is actually more stable. And this kind of pattern we will see in the other examples as well. So another thing I have here is kind of a crawling zombie version, where I took not actually a zombie, but the mocap biped 3, and the animation type is injured, and it male prone recover walk L1. And it looks like this, our guy here stands up, and I just called him a zombie coming out of his grave, and then he does this weird move here, which I cut off in the actual simulation. So what this looks like is this. And this time the vellum is on the left and the pop grains are on the right, and there's our guy moving out. Now, at first glance, they're pretty much the same, but I would again actually argue, if I would like to judge what I feel looks better, I would actually say the pop grains are better. And the funny thing is, I actually first thought that the vellum is on the right and was prepared to admit my defeat and say vellum looks better at least, but no, it doesn't. It flies off the back much quicker, which of course, to be fair, is something you can adjust. But the default settings already are, in my opinion, better in pop grains. The grain is kind of accumulating on its back in my opinion, more realistic way. And overall, as you can see, there are fewer outliers and the whole thing is more stable. Now, combined with the fact that the pop grains are actually faster again, as you can see here, I did a shorter test with 48 frames, and it came out with 2 minutes 35 and 1 minute 36 for the PopNet. And for the 120 frame version, the PopNet came out with 4 minutes and 5, and the Vellum version came out with 6 minutes 40. So you can see it's not half the speed, but it's pretty significant. It's not a small number. And I think this is a relatively good example for something you would have in production. Then here's another example, a very simple, just a ball of grains that falls down, nothing too complicated, really simple setup. And this came out with almost double the speed for pop grains, so 80 seconds for Vellum and 42 seconds for pop grains. Then I have a clumping example, and this is actually where it gets a bit more interesting, because clumping is something where the pop grains don't clearly win. You could argue that the vellum grains are kind of a bit more stable in the beginning, at least, where the pop grains kind of instantly break up. I'm pretty sure that you could, work on the setup a bit better. I didn't really care about the intricate details. But what you can see with the vellum grains is a problem that you often see with vellum is that the pieces are kind of, sliding around. And yeah, so it's a bit of a testing case where I would need to do a bit more research. But in terms of speed, you can see that the vellum grains are just a little bit behind to the pop grains. So when you use clumping, then it's worth looking into it. I still believe from my experience that pop grains are the better approach here because they tend to be more stable as far as I know. But I wouldn't want to give a clear, definitive answer on that. Okay, so now that you've seen why I don't necessarily recommend vellum grains because they're not faster, despite what some people think, and also they're not more stable. That's definitely something that does not match with my experience. They tend to be less stable. So slower and less stable doesn't really make a good alternative to pop grains. But before we move further, let's actually talk about when and why vellum grains can actually be quite interesting, because you can do things with vellum grains that you can't do with pop grains. The first very simple fact is that, of course, vellum grains automatically interact with vellum. So that means you can have something like this, where you have, like, I don't know, beans or whatever, let's call it what you want, interact with a cloth setup. And it's really straightforward because, it's just, two constraints that are combined. In this case, I used the vellum pack and vellum unpack to combine them. And it's really straightforward. There's nothing that you shouldn't be able to do with your knowledge so far. And here's another example that actually is out of more or less my own experience in production, not this particular thing, but I actually used a system where I had vellum grains, where I used vellum grains inside of some kind of vellum bag, and this actually worked quite well and was pretty stable. So especially when they're big, vellum grains can be a pretty interesting approach when interacting with vellum overall. But besides those obvious use cases, there are actually certain very interesting approaches that are definitely beyond what a beginner course should explain. But at least I want to show you something like this. It's a slime setup, and this is actually done with vellum grains. And you can see what interesting kind of behavior you can get out of this. It's not perfect, I didn't spend too much time on it, but this is exactly my point. You don't need to spend too much time to create something complex as this, because what's happening here is another big advantage of vellum grains. You can turn stuff into vellum grains, and then, and that's interesting, you can connect those points with vellum constraints. For example, a vellum glue constraint just looks for the closest point and connects them. So this is nothing really complicated. And then we also do a vellum attach to kind of attach them to some objects that tear the whole thing apart. And the interesting is when you add the breaking threshold to the vellum glue, then that means that the connection between the points can be broken. And what this looks like then is this, which looks a bit weird when you just look at the points, but it makes a bit more sense when you look at the actual constraints, because what happens here is they get stretched apart and then at some point they break. And this is of course because in the breaking threshold setup, the default is actually right, the stretch stress. So the further they are pulled apart, the more likely is that they break at some point, and then you get those, slimy kind of behavior. And what I did here, and there are other ways of doing this, but this is the approach I found for myself, is I just rebuild the actual constraints. So I turn the constraints into points. So I resample the curves. I turn those into VDBs. Those VDBs I smooth and then turn into geometry, which looks like this, and then give it some slimy color. And the result is this behavior. I will link some tutorials that explain this setup a bit better by Zybrand. who kind of created this concept, or at least where I've seen this kind of concept the first time, which is pretty clever. And as you can see, not too complicated. And the cool thing about this is, again, this is only possible with Vellum. I think you could try to do that with pop grains, but it would be probably super unstable. So this is a good example where Vellum grains totally make sense. But as you can see, it's more the kind of exotic kind of stuff. Finally, I want to finish with explaining actually not only this setup, but the setup we saw before. And that is actually one thing, and that is clumping. And in its core, what we need is the same approach that we use actually for pop grain clumping. And that is the the attraction weight attribute. So let's quickly set this up. We take, let's say, a sphere. Oh, no, actually, let's do it exactly how we did it in the test, because that works pretty well. So I just take a box as our source. This is where our grain will be emitted from, or will be turned into grain. Then actually use a Vellum configure grain. Again, it expects you to have points as an input, but you can also turn this button on, create points from volume, and then the system creates it for you. And let's first make sure that it works. And the thing is, we cannot use the Vellum solver directly. I mean, you can, because what you could do is you can break it up by right click and allow editing of contents. And then you can go inside, find the .NET, there it is, and change what I will do now in there. That's one way, but I think it's easier to show you how to just do it from scratch. We've seen that before. We just need a .NET work. It's not too complicated. And the constraints go into the second input. And here, of course, what we need is a Vellum solver, a Vellum object. And the nice thing about the Vellum object is that it's already prepared to take the geometry from the first input and the constraints from the second input. Then let's add some gravity to this. So what we want to do, of course, is we put in, let's say, a ground plane, and also a static object, because we want to have our sphere so that it breaks over some bit more complex collision object. Make sure that your merge is set to mutual as always. And now I'm lazy, I'm just stealing the OP input path expression from the Vellum object and put it in here. And what I need is a sub path. And let's say we take the fourth input, which actually I haven't connected yet. So let's go back up and make sure our sphere goes into the fourth input, and we should now see a grain simulation. It doesn't work. What's wrong? Not sure what's wrong. So the sphere goes in here. The collision guide on the RBD server looks fine as well. Let's delete the cache. Let's see if that was a problem. No. Why is it falling through? And the reason is actually something that surprises me. By default, the Vellum solver doesn't seem to use SDFs. So I was assuming that the volume collision is used, but it's not. It's actually, the solver default is actually surface collision. So if we turn this off and look at the surface collision representation, there is none. And the reason I think is because it's a PBD system. So there are two ways of solving this. Either you switch from primitive to polygon for the collision object, so that's an actual normal polygon, which we used so far, and then the system works. Or you make sure that actually it's not using the default, which seems to be the surface collision, but it's actually using the volume collision explicitly, and then it works as well, as we can see here. So it's up to you what you prefer. I'd stick for now with a solver default, because then I kind of use the intended approach. And let's run this again, and you can see it's not great. So before we move on, let's make sure that we actually use more sub-steps. And I say 10 for now should be enough. And let's see if it looks a bit better. And let's quickly re-display our collision object. And I think that's not too bad. That's stable enough for now. Currently, we don't have any clumping. And this is why I built this setup, because the clumping is actually hidden in the Vellum solver itself under advanced. And here you will find, where is it? It is under grain collisions, because what we want to use is the attraction weight. Now this is similar to how it works in pop grains, but it's important to know that you have to turn this on. The attraction weight by default is 0, And if you just turn it on, the automatic attraction is 10, which means that it's lower. And you should already see a little bit of clumping, yeah. And we will leave it at that right now. You can change the attraction strength basically, but what we will do is we will change the attraction weight with the attribute attraction weight, which is actually what it says here as well, as a name of the parameter. And this is something we did before with pop grains. So all we need to do is, and I do this after the constraint generation, even though I'm not 100% sure if, no, of course it's necessary because only the points only come out of this here. And in the point wrangle here, all I want to do is I set the attraction weight attribute and set it to a noise, and dependent on the position, of course. And to make this a bit more, to increase the contrast, well, let's first make this visible actually. All I do is I will take the attraction weight and pipe it into, there you go, pipe it into my color. And you can see it's not easy to see because it's pretty soft, because there's not much contrast right now. Of course, we know how to do that. We just use our fit function to put in a minimum in and a maximum in and map this to 0 and 1. And this allows us to change what is 0 and what is 1. And it looks like this. And while we're here, let's increase the scale even further with 5 as a multiplier. And this way, we can use the attraction weight attribute to control the clumping, just like in pop grain. So this should look familiar to you. So let's run this, and we should be able to see that with that technique, we can control where the clumping is happening. Of course, this is really a super quick setup with way too few points. I just wanted to quickly show you why we need to create our own .NET, so that we can actually change the attraction weight number under grain collisions in the Vellum solver. Again, you could have done the same by just using the normal Vellum solver. That works. And then make sure that you allow editing of contents. You go into the .NET, and there you find your Vellum solver. And here again under grain collisions, this number here, the attraction weight, is not exposed. So just turn it to 1, and then you can use the normal Vellum solver if you want as well, which is a bit faster, but I wanted to show you what it's all about. So in summary, in my experience from production and my research, Vellum grains are not faster than pop grains, quite the opposite. I couldn't find a single case where Vellum grains were faster than pop grains. In the best case, they are equally fast, but there are actually cases where pop grains are almost double as fast as Vellum. Also, in my experience, but this really depends on the case and might be a little bit subjective, Vellum grains tend to be less stable than pop grains. This is something I saw in production and in my research, but I'm sure there are cases where Vellum grains are fine in their stability, but I would definitely see as a tendency Vellum grains are less stable. What makes Vellum grains interesting though is that they provide certain options that you don't have with pop grains. So for example, they natively work with all the other Vellum setups, which is pretty nice for certain effects. And also they allow for some really exotic things you can do with this when you combine them with Vellum constraints. An example for that was the slime setup, which I will provide some links to learn more about this. So yeah, this is my conclusion about Vellum grains. I hope this was helpful. Thanks very much and see you later. Cheers.